Thanks for watching live or listening back to this show from Teachers Talk Radio. You can catch up with all our shows by visiting our YouTube channel or by listening back at ttradio.org. Don't forget to like and subscribe to enjoy more live education conversation from TTR. We hope you enjoy this show.
Outstanding and world-class vision and world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.
Hello. And good morning to the Friday Morning Break Show with me, Carl Smith, on Teachers Talk Radio, where this morning we ask the question left behind in plain sight: why are our white working class pupils falling behind? I've chosen this title very deliberately because the pupils we're talking about today are not hidden. They're not absent from our schools. And they're not difficult to find. They're sitting in classrooms across the country. They're in our assemblies. They're on our registers. They submit homework. They sit examinations. They move through the education system every single day. And yet, despite being highly visible, the education experience of many white working class pupils has somehow become remarkably easy to overlook, and we have overlooked it. And that's not because people don't care. It's not because schools aren't trying. It's not because no one has noticed. It's because the pattern has been present for so long that it risks becoming normal. And that's the uncomfortable truth at the heart of this episode. This isn't a new problem. This isn't a post-pandemic problem. This isn't even a problem that emerged during the last decade. In many respects, we're looking at a challenge that has been developing over generations. A challenge that sits at the intersection of education, economics, culture, geography, and history. A challenge that affects not just examination results, but life chances. And a challenge that asks difficult questions of all of us. Because if we genuinely believe that education is the great engine of opportunity, then we have to confront an uncomfortable reality. For a significant number of white working class children, that engine is not working as effectively as it should. Now, today we're going to divide the show into two parts. The first part we're going to spend will focus on diagnosis, how we got here. And then the second part will look at recommendations for change, how we can get to a better place. So let's start with the diagnosis first of all. Why does this pattern exist? Why has it persisted? And what can it tell us about the relationship between education and society more generally? Because before we can solve a problem, we have to understand it. And the truth is that this problem is far more complicated than many people realize. So let's begin where all the serious discussions should begin, with the evidence. Now, one of the challenges when discussing educational disadvantage is that people often arrive with assumptions. Some assume that the issue is just exaggerated. Others assume that they already know the cause. But the data tells a story that is both clearer and more complicated than either position. Across multiple years of Department for Education data, white British pupils eligible for free school meals have consistently been amongst the lowest performing groups in the English education system. According to the recent independent inquiry into white working class educational outcomes, in 2025, only 36% of white British pupils eligible for free school meals achieved a standard grade 4, that's a standard pass, or above in English and Maths GCSE. Only 36% of white British pupils eligible for free school meals, just a third. And that compares with 72% of pupils, all pupils, who were not eligible for free school meals, who got a standard pass. So 36% against 72%. You can see the gap is huge. In other words, disadvantaged white British pupils were only half as likely to achieve a standard pass in these core subjects. Now, there are approximately 1.25 million white British children in England who are eligible for free school meals, making this one of the largest, if not the largest, disadvantaged group in the education system. 1.25 million white British children who are half as likely to get a standard pass in the basics of English and maths as the rest of the population. That's a shocking statistic. I find it a shocking statistic. It's something that means a serious loss of talent in this country, never mind the huge social and political implications of having such a large group of people who are effectively in education no man's land. This pattern appears at primary school. It appears at secondary school. It appears in progression to higher education. And it appears in longer term educational outcomes. What's particularly striking is not the existence of the gap in itself, it's the persistence of the gap. The educational statistics do fluctuate, cohorts will vary, policies will change, examination systems will evolve. But this particular pattern remains remarkably stable. And stability in educational data should always make us pay attention, because this is not just a blip. This is a well-established trend. Structural trend, because it's a structural problem that remains. Now, I want to be careful here, because statistics can sometimes create the illusion that we're talking about abstract concepts. There's nothing abstract about what we're talking about. Every percentage point represents real children. Every attainment measure represents real futures. Every data point represents an individual story. And that's important to remember, because discussions about educational outcomes can quickly become discussions about numbers. And we're talking about people, real people, and real lives. Lives that will be shaped, at least in part, by the educational experiences that children have. And when we see the same patterns emerging repeatedly over long periods of time, it becomes increasingly difficult to argue that what we're observing is simply bad luck. Something deeper is happening. The question is what? So let me turn to poverty, but not poverty alone. Because the most obvious explanation for educational underachievement is poverty. Remember, we're looking at young people who qualify for free school meals. So it follows by definition that they are most likely to come from families that are poor or relatively poor. And poverty matters enormously. Anybody who tells you otherwise is simply wrong. Children growing up in poverty face challenges that their peers rarely face. Financial insecurity, housing instability, limited resources, less access to enrichment opportunities, greater stress in life, more uncertainty in life. All of these factors influence educational outcomes, and we see it in our schools every day. Teachers see it every day. Leaders see it every day. But most people in society don't see it every day because they don't get to find the stories behind the faces that they see in the high street or in any other place where they gather together. Here's the crucial point, though. If poverty alone explained educational outcomes, then all disadvantaged groups would perform in broadly similar ways. But they don't. The Sutton Trust's recent analysis found that white British pupils eligible for free school meals have one of the largest attainment gaps in the country. The gap between disadvantaged and non-disadvantaged white British pupils was a whopping 18.4 attainment points. That's the widest group of any major ethnic group. To give you an example, Indian and Bangladeshi disadvantaged pupils consistently outperform white British pupils who face similar economic disadvantage. So a person's ethnicity has a huge bearing on how they experience disadvantage and how that translates into educational outcomes. This is why the Education Select Committee concluded that poverty is a major factor, but it's not a sufficient explanation on its own. Children from a number of ethnic minority groups experience similar or higher levels of poverty while still achieving stronger educational outcomes. That observation doesn't diminish the importance of poverty, but it tells us that poverty is only part of the explanation rather than the entire explanation. The experience of disadvantage is clearly not uniform across different ethnic groups, never mind different genders. Different communities experience disadvantage differently. Different groups develop different relationships with education. Different histories produce different outcomes. And that's where the conversation becomes more complicated. Because once we move beyond poverty alone, well, we start encountering factors that are harder to measure. Culture, identity, expectation, place, history, belonging. These things are difficult to quantify. Often people don't record them in surveys, and they find it even difficult to explain what makes them who they are. But it doesn't mean that they're not real. It doesn't mean that they're unimportant. In fact, one could go quite the opposite. The factors that are hardest to measure are often the factors that matter most. Nowhere is that more obvious than when we start looking at geography. So let's think about place and geography for a moment. One of the strongest themes emerging from research on white working class underachievement is the importance of place. Because where children grow up matters. Recent Sutton Trust research has revealed enormous geographical differences in opportunity for white working class people depending on where they live. A white British pupil eligible for free school meals, growing up, however, in one of the highest performing areas, can expect dramatically different outcomes from a similar pupil elsewhere. To give you an example, a white working class young person raised in the very affluent Kensington and Bayswater can expect to earn over 50% more by the age of 28 than a comparable white working class young person growing up in Newcastle upon Tyne, Central and West. So the same level of poverty, but a different location, means a different education outcome and a different earning potential. And this matters because educational outcomes are not simply individual outcomes. They're often shaped by local labour markets, transport networks, community infrastructure, and access to opportunity. So the white working class young person in Kensington and Bayswater may be experiencing poverty, but they are living surrounded by opportunity. They have the transport to be able to access that opportunity. Aspiration and ambition are all around them. And there has been a long history of success in the communities living in those areas over time. Unfortunately, there are many areas of the country where that simply isn't the case. It matters because we sometimes don't acknowledge that fact. When the government or Ofsted are looking at measuring success in schools, they might take a general proxy like disadvantage and then apply it equally to all schools. But in fact, that would be profoundly unfair because the same proxy will, on average, produce different outcomes in different parts of the country. So let's think about which places we're talking about, the places that are most commonly associated with lower white working class attainment. Any one of these ones: former mining communities, coastal towns, post-industrial settlements, very isolated rural areas. And these are not random locations. They share certain characteristics. They've experienced profound and long-lasting economic decline. Many have seen the traditional industries that dominated the landscape disappear entirely. Many of them have struggled to attract new investment since, say, the 1980s. Many of them have witnessed the gradual erosion of local institutions and the opportunities that go with that. Everything from youth clubs to sports opportunities. So let me be clear. None of these places are by definition deficient. The people in them don't lack strengths or moral fibre. The people in them don't lack community spirit. But economic and social context matters. And when schools are being judged, these things are not generally factored in because they're difficult to measure. But the fact is, children absorb the messages around them from the environments they live in. They may not consciously do it, they may not be able to articulate it, but it affects what they think and what they do. They observe local employment patterns. They notice who succeeds. They see which life pathways appear realistic. And over time, those observations shape expectations, not necessarily consciously, but really powerfully. So a child growing up in a community where professional occupations are relatively rare will have a very different perception of possibility than a child growing up surrounded by people working in professional careers. So if you're born in a family that regularly move in quite, senior professional circles, even if you yourself are poor, even if you yourself are not particularly doing well at school, you will absorb that ambition and that expectation. It'll become part of your manner, part of what you believe people are capable of. It doesn't mean in the other areas that ambition is lower. It just means the reference points are very different. And the reference points really matter, because aspiration does not emerge out of nowhere. It develops through exposure, through example, through visibility, through a belief that something is achievable. And if opportunities feel distant, aspiration can become very difficult to sustain. It's not because young people don't care. It's just because imagining alternative futures requires evidence that those futures exist, and they just haven't had exposure to those. Let's take a case study. Let me introduce you to Emily. Now, Emily isn't a real pupil. She's a composite of dozens of pupils many of us will recognize. Emily lives in a coastal community. Emily works hard. She behaves well. Teachers like her. She isn't disengaged. She isn't disruptive. She isn't failing. But when conversations turn to the future, something becomes apparent. Her horizons are narrow. When asked what she wants to do, Emily talks about things she's seen, things she knows, things that feel familiar. And that's perfectly understandable. Human beings aspire within the boundaries of what appears possible. The challenge is that those boundaries can become very restrictive. What changed Emily's perspective wasn't an assembly. It wasn't a motivational speech. It wasn't somebody telling her to dream bigger. It was exposure to meeting people, seeing workplaces, visiting universities, talking to professionals, experiencing opportunities beyond her immediate environment. And slowly, in this particular case, her assumptions about the future expanded. Not because she suddenly became more ambitious, but because she became more informed. And that distinction matters enormously, because one of the biggest misconceptions in education is that white working class people or pupils somehow lack aspiration. But the evidence for that claim has always been very weak. Many of them aspire. Many of them care deeply about their future, and many of them do actually value education. The challenge is not aspiration, it's visibility. The visibility of opportunity, or in other words, knowing that an opportunity exists in the first place. It's also about feeling a sense of belonging to that opportunity, because I've known many young people who are clearly able, they've got lots to offer, but because they don't see what's possible, they believe that if they tried for those things, they wouldn't belong in that world. That's not who they are. It's not for people like them. And they might even think it was some form of betrayal of their background to aim for those things, as if they were rejecting their own kind, their own people. Let's think about the long shadow of economic change for a moment. I'm a history teacher, so it's a part of the story I find especially important, because educational outcomes don't emerge in isolation. They emerge from historical circumstances. Many communities currently associated with lower educational outcomes once offered stable employment, and that employment didn't necessarily require the full range of academic qualifications. Mining, steel, manufacturing, construction, shipbuilding, heavy industry. These weren't fallback options. These were respected careers. These were the industries that made Britain what it became in the middle of the 20th century. They offered stability, identity, purpose, economic security. Education still mattered, but it wasn't the sole route to opportunity. But then the economy changed. Britain was the first country to industrialize in the world. And then in the 1970s, it became the first country to deindustrialize in the world. We didn't exactly know it at the time, but we were moving from a primarily heavy industry and manufacturing economy to one much more heavily based on services. So now most of our economy is based on those services. But those services will move to the locations where they're most needed, which aren't necessarily the same as the locations where the heavy industry was based. And those services require a different set of skills and qualifications, not ones traditionally concentrated in those areas. So the industries declined. Employment patterns shifted. The qualifications became more important. The labour market evolved. And communities that had been organised around one model of economic life suddenly found themselves facing a completely different one. The challenge is that cultural adaptation. Often it takes longer than economic adaptation. Sure, the labour market transformed within a decade, but community expectations can take generations to move. Many of those communities that suffered industrial decline in the 70s and 80s still haven't, as a community, reformed themselves. So there are much higher levels of mental health problems and medical problems, as well as very entrenched political and social attitudes, which will not simply disappear by putting on a different course or just telling people that they should change. These communities found themselves navigating a world where educational credentials were becoming increasingly important, but they were still carrying the cultural memories of a very different economic order. That's nobody's fault, but it's part of the story. And if we ignore the history, we struggle to understand the present. But how often do Ofsted or the Department for Education factor in the history of an area? How often do they understand the history of an area when making decisions about the effectiveness or appropriateness of schools and their offer? Many of the communities now associated with lower educational outcomes also experience some of the largest economic shocks of the late 20th century. Jobs that once provided secure pathways into adulthood have disappeared and often not been replaced by equivalent local opportunities. The challenge is that while the labour market increasingly rewards qualifications, many communities have experienced so many decades of economic uncertainty and declining opportunity that now it's really difficult for young people to reorientate and get those qualifications. Social Mobility Commission and Sutton Trust research consistently identifies former industrial and coastal communities amongst those facing the greatest barriers to education and economic progression. One of the least discussed factors in education is educational inheritance. Not inheritance in the financial sense, inheritance in the experiential sense. Educational experiences are often transmitted across generations. Parents who had positive experiences at school are often more confident engaging with education, more confident supporting learning, more confident navigating career pathways, more confident advocating for their child and opportunities. By contrast, families whose experiences of education were less positive may approach schools differently, not because they care less, but because they carry different expectations. And this is where trust becomes incredibly important. Schools don't simply educate children, they build relationships with families. And those relationships are influenced by the history of the communities and even often the history of the family, personal history, family history, community history. It can even reflect particular wards or even streets within those communities. When schools successfully build trust with those communities, remarkable things can happen. When trust is absent, progress becomes harder, not impossible, but harder. The Sutton Trust argues that parental experiences of education continue to shape educational engagement today. This is regardless of the actual amount of financial security the family has. White working class parents are significantly more likely to report negative experiences of school themselves. And this can influence how families engage with educational institutions. The trust highlights evidence that disadvantaged pupils from Black, African, Bangladeshi, Pakistani, and Indian backgrounds are several times more likely to receive private tuition than disadvantaged white British pupils. Their cultural background, their history, their family history is different, no matter where they're actually based or what their financial position is. And these differences help illustrate how educational support practices vary considerably between communities. Now, literacy is the foundation beneath everything in education. If there's one issue that appears repeatedly through this discussion, it should be literacy. Again and again, reading, vocabulary, language, comprehension. These are the foundations upon which educational success is built. And when foundations are weak, everything above them becomes difficult. Just think about it. Every subject relies on reading. History requires reading. Science requires reading. Geography requires reading. Mathematics increasingly requires reading. The curriculum is in many ways a literacy curriculum. Now, here's what's particularly challenging. Vocabulary gaps emerge early, often before children arrive at school. And unless those gaps are addressed, they just keep widening. They compound over time. This is not about intelligence. It's not about innate ability. It's about exposure. Language acquisition depends upon opportunity. Children exposed to a broader range of language generally arrive at school with larger vocabularies, and larger vocabularies unlock learning. That relationship is incredibly powerful, which is why literacy remains one of the strongest levers available to schools. Not the only lever, but perhaps one of the most important. The Education Select Committee reported that in 2018-19, only 53% of British white children eligible for free school meals reached a good development of literacy at the end of the early years foundation stage. That's one of the lowest, if not the lowest rate amongst disadvantaged ethnic groups. By the time children reach secondary school, the literacy gaps are often deeply entrenched. Reading isn't simply another subject, it's the mechanism through which pupils access every other part of the curriculum. Now let's talk about something less tangible, identity. Because success isn't just academic, it's psychological. Children need to believe they belong in education. They need to believe success is compatible with who they are. And this matters because educational identity develops remarkably early in life. You've probably heard people say things like, I'm not academic, I'm not clever, school isn't really my thing. What's striking is how often these statements emerge long before any evidence justifies them. They're not declarations of ability, they're declarations of identity. And identity influences behavior, and behavior influences effort, and effort influences outcomes, which means eventually identity influences attainment. And that's where belonging becomes crucial. When people see people like themselves succeeding, belonging grows. When they don't, belonging can weaken. And that has profound implications because achievement or underachievement isn't just a skills problem, it's a belonging problem. So how we arrive at the final question of this first half. How has the system allowed this situation to persist? Because nobody set out to create these outcomes. No one designed a system to disadvantage white working class pupils, but yet that's the pattern as it remains. Part of the pattern, part of the answer, I think, is familiarity. Back in 2021, the House of Commons Education Committee described white working class pupils as a forgotten group, arguing they've been let down by decades of neglect and muddled policy thinking. The committee noted that disadvantaged white British pupils underperformed from the early years right through to higher education. That phrase, forgotten group, is worth reflecting on, not because these children are invisible, but because persistent underachievement can become normalised. And once a problem becomes normalised, urgency begins to disappear. And when a problem persists for long enough, it becomes normalised. People stop being surprised. Urgency diminishes. The issue becomes part of the landscape. Another factor is that underachievement's quiet. Not all education problems announce themselves dramatically. Some just emerge gradually. A reading gap here, a confidence issue there, an attendance problem later, a missed opportunity somewhere else. Individually, these things seem manageable, but collectively they become significant. And because they accumulate slowly, they just evade attention until the consequences become visible years later. And that's perhaps the central episode of this part of the programme. Education outcomes are rarely created by a single event. They emerge from thousands of small interactions, experiences and opportunities accumulated over time. And when these experiences consistently point in the same direction, patterns emerge. Patterns that become statistics. Patterns that become life outcomes. Patterns that shape communities. So we've examined the evidence. We've explored poverty, place, history, literacy, identity, and expectation. We've looked at why the problem exists, why it persists, and most importantly, we've challenged the idea that any single explanation is sufficient, because it's not one problem. It's many problems interacting over a long period of time. And quite simply, when our schools are judged, when money is allocated, all these factors are not taken account of. The factors that are taken account of are the simple proxies that we can measure, and they only tell half the story. The stakes are high in these schools. Just 16% of disadvantaged white British pupils entered higher education by the age of 19. 16%, according to parliamentary evidence. And more recent data suggests progression remains below 1 in 5. These pupils are not only underrepresented in universities, they're likely to earn lower wages, reduced economic mobility, and have poorer life outcomes in adulthood. So it's about a lot more than examination results. It's about fairness. It's about social mobility. Now we're going to take a break. We're going to listen to our sponsors and the latest educational news. Hope you stick with us, and we'll see you after the break.
As teachers, we know the barriers girls face go far beyond the classroom. That's why the FA and Barclays Made for This Game Breaking Barriers campaign is taking on two of the biggest barriers girls face today: misogyny and body confidence. Right now, 56% of teachers say they don't feel confident discussing these topics with their students, and that's exactly where this campaign can help. With free, easy-to-use resources and a podcast designed for busy teachers, Breaking Barriers gives you practical support to help start the conversations, creating more positive environments for girls in school, in sport, and beyond. It's time to empower girls to believe they belong. Go to girlsfootballinschools.org and click on Made for This Game.
In education, we all want recruitment to be fair and inclusive, because the gender pay gap won't disappear without clear, practical steps in how we hire. Recent national research shows schools are already taking meaningful action. 40% of leaders now include pay or progression details in adverts. 35% highlight well-being support, and around 1 in 5 are using anonymised shortlisting to reduce bias. Teaching vacancies, the Department for Education's free official job listing service, makes these steps easier, with clear salary fields, flexible working filters, and an application format that supports blind recruitment. It also removes previous salary questions, so candidates are assessed on their skills and experience rather than their past pay. For your next hire or your next role, go online and search Teaching Vacancies Gov UK.
This show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit hachetlearning.com to explore the full range of titles.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
The BBC covers what it describes as the exchange of harsh words between Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson and Conservative leader Kemi Badenoch. The Tory leader called Phillipson a spiteful class warrior for taxing private school fees after the number of teachers has gone down, despite Labour saying the tax would pay for more in the state sector, even though it was not specifically ring-fenced for this. BBC Fact Check notes that whilst Badenoch was right to say teacher numbers have fallen, the pupil-teacher ratio has remained the same. Phillipson responded to the comment on BBC Radio 4's Today programme, telling host Nick Robinson she would get a t-shirt saying spiteful class warrior because if it means lifting 500,000 children out of poverty, I'll be wearing that t-shirt with pride. The Telegraph says overnight school trips are being cut short because parents are worried about their children in what it calls an increase in post-COVID anxiety. Companies offering residential trips away from home have said parents are demanding shorter visits and have started picking their children up early. Earlier this month, the Education Secretary warned parents against coddling their children because it shields them from the real world and they were becoming less likely to take risks. Schools Week focuses on what it calls a new chapter for Teach First, as the government-funded teacher training scheme gets a new name. The scheme will still be run by the charity named Teach First, but will be delivered under the new title Teach, Lead, Change. DfE has also confirmed it will be dropping the requirement for 60% of trainees to come from Russell Group universities. They have retained the requirement that 90% of candidates must have a 2-1 degree or higher, meaning quality will be maintained. The new programme will begin in September 2027 and will be responsible for training 3 cohorts of trainees up to 2031. Finally, even before the recent spell of heatwave, uniforms were a hot topic, but the BBC has focused on research from the University of Bradford on uniform rules. Dr. Elizabeth Nasom says uniform rules are increasingly out of step with the realities of young people, but that removing them is not the way forward. She says having more choice and listening to what pupils really want would help, as well as avoiding inflexible rules which lead to damaging interactions between staff and pupils. During the hot weather, many schools have relaxed their uniform rules, and parents and pupils have praised flexibility at a time of climate uncertainty. This has been Teachers Talk Radio News with Jo Fox.
And welcome back to Teachers Talk Radio with me, Carl Smith, on the Friday Morning Break Show, where we are considering the question, left behind in plain sight, why white working class pupils are falling behind. Now, in the first part, we considered what the problem was. We looked at poverty, we looked at place, we looked at literacy, we looked at identity, we looked at family history, economic change, aspiration, and belonging. And if there's one thing I hope became clear, it's this: there's no single cause of white working class achievement, underachievement, which means there can be no one single solution. If the problem were one thing, we could solve it with one intervention, one funding stream, one reform, one initiative. But this challenge was built over decades, and a challenge built over decades won't disappear quickly. The good news is, however, that we know far more about how it works than we often admit. Schools have improved outcomes, communities have improved outcomes, trusts have improved outcomes. The question is not whether improvement is possible. The question is, are we prepared to pursue it with sufficient seriousness and consistency? And are we prepared to pursue it in an intelligent way rather than a blunt way, where we cast blame on schools and communities where clearly the problems are far more complex than crude measures would allow? Because what happens next matters enormously. Education outcomes don't just stay inside schools, they become life outcomes. So what's at stake? Well, one of the problems with educational outcomes is that we just sometimes talk about exam results as if they're the final destination, but they're not. The starting point, but only that. A GCSE result becomes a qualification, and a qualification becomes a pathway, and a pathway becomes employment, and employment becomes income, and income influences housing, and housing influences health, and health influences the quality of life, and quality of life influences the opportunities available to the next generation. And that's why attainment matters, not because examinations are everything, but because they open and close doors. The Sutton Trust found that 9% of white British pupils eligible for free school meals go on to achieve an undergraduate degree by the age of 22. 9%, compared to the national average of 29%. So a gap of 20%. These figures matter because educational attainment remains one of the strongest predictors of what you earn in life, your employment, your career progression, and all manner of other life outcomes ranging from medical health, mental health, and goodness knows what else besides. Let's take employment and earnings. The Sutton Trust recent Crossing Paths study found that geography and educational opportunity combine to create enormous long-term differences in earnings. A white working class young person raised in Kensington and Bayswater can expect to earn 50% more by the age of 28 than a comparable pupil in Newcastle upon Tyne, as we said before, which raises a crucial point. Educational inequality eventually becomes economic inequality. People with higher qualifications typically experience higher earnings, lower unemployment, greater job security, increased opportunities for progression. The Star Academy's inquiry, published a couple of weeks ago, argued that educational underachievement should not just be viewed as a school issue, yet schools are held accountable as though it is, because it directly influences economic opportunities across adulthood and directly feeds off the history, the culture, the identity of the area in which the school is based. White working class young people are significantly less likely to progress through educational pathways that lead to higher paying professions and sectors than other young people. Think about that for a moment. We're not talking about different levels of effort. We're not talking about dramatically different abilities. We're talking about the influence of opportunity. Think about housing and financial security. Lower earnings are not simply about spending power. They affect every aspect of financial stability. Home ownership, savings, credit access, economic resilience, the ability to withstand unexpected setbacks. Educational outcomes are therefore connected to wealth accumulation and long-term security. And these effects compound over years decades, generations. The attainment gap finally becomes a wealth gap. The relationship between health and education is one of the most consistent findings in social research. Lower education attainment is associated with poorer physical health, poorer mental health, increased stress, reduced life expectancy. And that's not because education directly causes health, it's because education influences the conditions in which people live. Income, stability, housing, work, community, security, these do shape health. And the education gap can eventually become a health gap, even a life expectancy gap. Let's think about social mobility for a minute. The statistics on progression are striking. Only 18% of white British pupils eligible for free school meals progress onto higher education by the age of 19, whereas 62% of Black African pupils and 58% of Indian pupils from similarly disadvantaged backgrounds progress to higher education. That is an enormous gap. This isn't just about university attendance, it's about mobility. It's about whether young people have genuine freedom to shape their own futures. And in too many cases, social mobility is very limited. Now we need to widen the lens, because educational underachievement is not solely an individual problem, it's a societal. When large numbers of young people fail to reach their potential, society loses all that talent. Remember that British white working class pupils represent about 1.25 million young people in England. It's not a niche group. It affects everybody, the whole country. It's the largest disadvantaged cohort in the education system. So even if we were able to make modest improvements in their attainment, it would have substantial economic and social benefits. And talent is one of the most valuable resources any nation possesses. The UK's long-standing productivity problems are often discussed in terms of investment, technology, and infrastructure. But there's another factor, human capital, and it's possibly the most important. Skills, knowledge, capability. If large numbers of young people leave education without developing their talents, economic productivity suffers in the long run. The attainment gap becomes everybody's problem and an economic problem for everybody. It's not merely an educational one. Employers across multiple sectors report difficulties recruiting skilled workers. And at the same time, significant numbers of young people remain disconnected from opportunity. These two problems are connected. A well-functioning education system should help bridge that gap. Now, the STAR report also highlighted the problem of geographical disadvantage or regional disadvantage. Opportunity is unevenly distributed. Educational outcomes are unevenly distributed. Economic prosperity is unevenly distributed. And these inequalities often reinforce one another. The result is a cycle that can be difficult to break. So let's discuss something schools rarely talk about, trust. Because education outcomes shape more than careers. They shape relationships with other institutions. Research consistently finds links between educational attainment and civic participation. The willingness to vote, the willingness to volunteer, the willingness to engage in your local community, trust in public institutions. When individuals feel disconnected from opportunity, they begin to feel disconnected from institutions more broadly. This isn't a party political point, it's a democratic one. The STAR inquiry highlights concerns about disengagement and feelings of being overlooked within some white working class communities. Because if people believe systems do not work for them, trust weakens and trust matters. Because healthy societies depend upon citizens believing that effort can lead to progress. So the next time you hear somebody saying, well, all these politicians, They're all in it for themselves. They never do anything. They never follow up on their promises. What they're really saying is they feel completely disconnected with authority and with people in positions of power. They don't trust them anymore. They don't believe that they have their best interests at heart. And that then is applied to the police, the health service, schools, and every other form of public service authority. So we all then find that we don't have any trust from those people. So we're then subject to a tsunami of complaints and sometimes worse. Just going to take a short break to go back to the ads, and then we'll come back for the final part.
As teachers, we know the barriers girls face go far beyond the classroom. That's why the FA and Barclays Made for This Game Breaking Barriers campaign is taking on two of the biggest barriers girls face today: misogyny and body confidence. Right now, 56% of teachers say they don't feel confident discussing these topics with their students, and that's exactly where this campaign can help. With free, easy-to-use resources and a podcast designed for busy teachers, Breaking Barriers gives you practical support to help start the conversations, creating more positive environments for girls in school, in sport, and beyond. It's time to empower girls to believe they belong. Go to girlsfootballinschools.org and click on Made for This Game.
In education, we all want recruitment to be fair and inclusive because the gender pay gap won't disappear without clear, practical steps in how we hire. Recent national research shows schools are already taking meaningful action. 40% of leaders now include pay or progression details in adverts. 35% highlight well-being support, and around 1 in 5 are using anonymised shortlisting to reduce bias. Teaching vacancies, the Department for Education's free official job listing service, makes these steps easier with clear salary fields, flexible working filters, and an application format that supports blind recruitment. It also removes previous salary questions so candidates are assessed on their skills and experience rather than their past pay. For your next hire or your next role, go online and search Teaching Vacancies Gov UK.
This show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit hachetlearning.com to explore the full range of titles.
Good morning and welcome back to the last part of my Friday morning break show with me, Carl Smith, this morning, where we asked the question, left behind in public sight, in plain sight, why white working class pupils are falling behind. So we need a new national strategy. The inquiry proposes something different, the STAR inquiry. Not a programme, not a project, not a short-term initiative, but a long-term national effort. And the report's explicit that this challenge cannot be solved by schools alone. And schools cannot be held accountable for it alone. Government has a role, employers have a role, families have a role, colleges have a role, universities have a role, community organisations have a role. Everyone has a role. The scale of the solution must match the scale of the problem. One of the clearest messages emerging from the report is that intervention must begin early, very early. The inquiry recommends extending access to 30 hours of free childcare for disadvantaged families, significantly expanding Best Start family hubs, improving transition into primary school, investing in the early years workforce. Why? Because by the time children arrive at school, developmental gaps already exist. Remember the statistic from earlier in the show. Only 53% of free school meals eligible white British children achieve a good level of development at the end of the early years foundation stage. Only 53%. So the other 47% are already well behind. We cannot solve the problem by dealing with year 11 We've got to solve the problem by dealing with year one, or even well before year one. Make reading a national mission. If there's one recommendation running through the entire report, it's about reading. The inquiry argues that reading fluency should become a national priority. Not simply phonics, not simply decoding. Reading fluency, reading comprehension, reading enjoyment, reading confidence. The goal is not merely passing a screening check. The goal is ensuring every child leaves primary school capable of independently accessing the secondary curriculum. The report is very clear. Every unresolved literacy gap becomes a future potential attainment gap, and then an economic gap. Let's reimagine secondary education. One of the most interesting aspects of the inquiry focuses on Key Stage 3, years 7, 8 and 9. The report argues these years have been undervalued, or schools haven't been rewarded for focusing on the important things. Too often, secondary education is all about GCSE preparation. Schools are rewarded for that, but they're not rewarded for all the attitudes, habits, identities, and progress that's made at Key Stage 3 that makes it possible to do well at Key Stage 4 and in life. The recommendations include treating Key Stage 3 as a distinct phase, improving transition from primary school, strengthening pastoral support, increasing engagement, maintaining belonging. This is because attendance, engagement, and confidence often begin to decline more during these years. By the time the problem's visible in year 11, the roots stretch so far back, it's extremely difficult to untangle them. The report also repeatedly turns to one important idea. Many young people struggle to see how education connects to future opportunity. If learning feels disconnected from real life, motivation suffers. So the recommendations include stronger careers education, earlier employer engagement, improved work experience, clearer destination pathways, better understanding of local labour markets. The inquiry argues that education should feel meaningful, not because every lesson has to be immediately practical, but because pupils need to understand why learning matters. And as the report suggests, many young people need clearer answers to the simple question, how will this help me build my future? One of the strengths of the inquiry is that it avoids presenting university as the only successful outcome. Indeed, it advocates a broader vision. The recommendations include strengthening further education colleges, massively expanding apprenticeships, improving technical pathways, increasing flexibility in higher education, creating clearer progression routes for young people. The report argues that young people should be able to move flexibly between education, training, and employment. Success should not be defined by one route. Success should be defined by opportunity. One of the report's powerful themes concerns belonging. Schools cannot solve every challenge alone, and they should not be held to blame for not doing that. And yet currently they are. All too often, it's easy to write a report or colour code a failure, condemning the people working with problems as complicated and as deeply entrenched as they often are in some of the communities where underachievement is common. Simply saying, well, it happens in some schools is not good enough, because there might be important differences between those schools and the location they're operating in and the resources they have available, and apparently similar schools that aren't actually similar at all. Families matter, communities matter, relationships matter, history matters. Therefore, the inquiry recommends deeper parental engagement, stronger school community partnerships, expanded enrichment provision, and greater extracurricular participation. Importantly, the report supports a properly funded enrichment entitlement. The reasoning is straightforward. Many white working class communities have experienced a decline in youth provision. Schools increasingly act as civic anchors. The report argues they should be supported to do so because for some pupils, enrichment isn't just an optional extra. It's their primary source of opportunity, cultural capital, and wider experience. Teaching, the single biggest lever. Teaching. Throughout this inquiry, schools achieving strong outcomes shared one common characteristic: high quality teaching. The report describes this as the single biggest lever available for improving outcomes. So its recommendations include stronger teacher recruitment, better retention, local teacher pipelines, improved training, greater understanding of working class white communities, because ultimately every reform eventually arrives in a classroom. Every policy, every strategy, every recommendation, its success depends on the quality of the interactions between teachers and pupils. Everything else builds on that foundation. But crucially for me, it also must be taken account of properly in the accountability framework. It isn't an excuse to talk about the long history of industrial decline in a particular area. It isn't an excuse to talk about rural isolation and lack of cultural capital. Yet that isn't what reports on schools and judgments on schools do take account of. Why? Because that information isn't easily measured. Well, we've got to be better than that. We've got to be more intelligent than that. We've got to start working with schools and making schools accountable in a much more intelligent, nuanced, well-informed way to stop thousands of our best people leaving schools and education because they've been condemned, because they've been placed in impossible positions, because unfair judgments have been made against them, because of a lack of understanding of the problems that they face. So the accountability system has to change. Yes, that includes Ofsted. Yes, that includes league tables. Yes, that includes the way that qualifications translate into points and other scores for schools. It's got to include a much more subtle, a much more intuitive and intelligent system if it's going to properly capture those schools that are able to do or able to show the way on how to do things well. So let's return to where we began. Emily and thousands of young people like her. Different stories, different communities, different circumstances, but the same underlying challenge. It's the risk is that we see this conversation as being one just about poverty, but it isn't just about poverty. Ethnicity matters, history matters, culture matters, identity matters, gender matters. Probably most importantly, identity and culture. I think it's fundamentally a conversation about potential, about whether talent is recognized where it exists, about whether opportunity is genuinely available to all, about whether we are willing to sustain attention long enough to really change outcomes, or whether we're just playing at it. Because the report's final message is not pessimistic, it's hopeful. The strengths within white working class communities should be celebrated, repeated. Those people are proud of themselves and we should be proud of them. Humor, resilience, loyalty, identity, pride, community. Don't condemn them. Don't tell them they're wrong. Don't tell them their history is wrong or bad, or that they're bad people. Tell them that the system around them has perhaps not worked in their favor and that we want that to change. Give them opportunities for it to change. The challenge is building an education system that better recognizes and builds on the strengths it already has. And this brings us back full circle. Being left behind isn't an identity. It's not a destiny. It's not an inevitability. It's a process, and processes can be changed. They must be changed. Thank you for listening. You've been listening to the Friday Morning Break Show with me, Carl Smith, on Teacher Talk Radio. Don't make sure that you don't miss out on all the other great shows on Teachers Talk Radio that happen every day. Thank you, and I'll see you soon.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.